I stood in the ballroom, wearing my press dress uniform, while my father screamed that I was a disgrace, while my sister in her $8,000 wedding gown told security to remove me, while my brother-in-law, the man I knew was a federal fraud, ordered me off his private property. 300 people were watching. Nobody was moving. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. I simply opened a manila folder and said, "Your real name is Gregory Paul Miller, and you have active federal warrants across 2 states. His face went white. What happened that day wasn't just a confrontation, it was the ending of a story that started 10 years earlier, when I was 20 years old, standing in our front hallway in Houston, with an enlistment packet in my hands. I need to tell you why this moment matters, and I need to start at the beginning, because if I don't, you won't understand why I could stand there so calm, so sure, while my entire family was collapsing around me. The reason I'm telling this story is because someone needs to hear that your value doesn't come from other people's approval. And after everything I went through, I learned something most people only learn when it's too late. 10 years ago, in the Westlake neighborhood of Houston, I was the disappointment. My father, Marcus, had constructed an entire identity around prestige country club memberships, charity galas, the kinds of events where people discuss their children's careers, like they're discussing luxury vehicles. My younger sister Sophia had just been accepted to Rice University's medical school. She was the golden child, the investment that paid off. My father practically floated through our house for a week. He called everyone his business partners, his friends at the golf club, even his barber, his daughter, the future doctor. Can you imagine? That's what he'd say. And then I walked into the living room, with a different kind of envelope in my hands. It was cream-colored with military insignia embossed on it. My enlistment paperwork. I remember his face. I remember the exact moment when his pride turned into something else, something darker. He stared at the documents like they were a personal insult. He didn't yell at first. That would have been easier. He was very quiet. He walked to the front door without saying a word, opened it, and looked at me with this expression that I still see sometimes when I'm falling asleep. It said, "You are not my daughter anymore. Take your things," he said. His voice was flat. "Only failures join the military. Only people without options. You're throwing away your life, and I won't be here to watch it." My mother was standing in the kitchen doorway. She didn't move. She didn't defend me. She just watched. What I didn't understand at that moment was that this wasn't really about the military at all. It was about the fact that I had chosen something he couldn't control, something he couldn't brag about at his club, something that didn't fit the narrative he had spent 20 years constructing. My father then walked outside and began throwing my belongings onto the lawn. My clothes, my textbooks, the photo albums my grandmother had given me. Everything. I watched from the window as he hurled them one by one onto the manicured grass. My sister Sophia appeared beside him in that moment, and she was smiling. Not cruelly exactly, just satisfied, like my rejection somehow validated her acceptance. She was holding a champagne flute. That detail stuck with me for years. I could have screamed. I could have cried. I could have begged him to reconsider. Instead, I felt something inside me shift. It was subtle at first, a kind of coldness, a clarity. I walked into my room, packed my duffel bag with the things that still mattered: my grandmother's letters, a photograph of my great-uncle who had served in Vietnam, and I didn't look at my father again. I picked up that bag, I looked him in the eyes, and I walked past him onto the lawn where my clothes were scattered. The neighbors were watching. I didn't care. As I carried my things to the car, I remember making a promise to myself that would become the foundation for everything that came next. I promised that I would never, ever allow my worth to be determined by a man who loved me conditionally. I would build something they couldn't dismantle. I promised that the next time my father heard my name, it wouldn't be with shame. It would be with respect. If you have ever been in a room where your own parent looked at you like you were a stranger, like your very existence had become an embarrassment to them, you know how that hollows you out. It's not like other rejections. It's worse because it's supposed to be unconditional. You're supposed to matter just by being born. When that's taken away, there's a specific kind of silence that falls over everything. But silence, I learned, was something I could use. I enlisted 2 weeks later. The basic training facility in San Antonio was nothing like the neighborhood I grew up in. It was harsh and loud and unforgiving. And I loved it. Here's the thing that people don't understand about military service. It offers something that broken families can't: unconditional belonging. These people didn't care that my father had rejected me. They didn't care about my family's status or the fact that I didn't come from money. They cared about whether I could run faster than I did yesterday. They cared about whether I had my teammates back. My worth was determined by my actions, not by whose daughter I was. For the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere that made sense. Over the next decade, I earned my stripes. I specialized in military criminal investigations, learning to read people, to spot inconsistencies, to understand that most lies leave traces if you know how to look. And I built a life that was entirely my own. I was nobody's reflection anymore. The feedback from my family came in fragments over the years, usually through mutual acquaintances or distant relatives who couldn't resist passing along gossip. Sophia had finished her residency. She was engaged. The groom was. This is where I should tell you about Richard. Because Richard seemed perfect. According to family chatter, he was a retired major with extensive combat experience. He had transitioned into the defense technology sector and was now a wealthy consultant driving sports cars and promising to elevate our family's profile even further. My father was reportedly the proudest he'd been in years. His future son-in-law was a decorated military officer, a patriot. Everything my father respected. Unlike his disgraced military daughter, apparently. That detail, when I heard it, didn't hurt as much as it used to. I had built enough of myself that his judgment had lost its power. But something about Richard bothered me, and I couldn't stop thinking about why. 3 weeks before the wedding, a thick invitation arrived. It wasn't from my father or Sophia. It was from our Aunt Elena, the one family member who had quietly disagreed with my exile. She had sent me the formal invitation along with a magazine clipping. The feature was titled, High Society Union. Medical Professional Weds. Decorated War Hero. There was a photograph. Sophia in a designer gown. And beside her, Richard in a military dress uniform, absolutely covered in medals and ribbons. He looked impressive to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But I knew what I was looking at, and my investigative instincts started screaming. His ribbon rack was a disaster. Absolutely chaotic. Medals that required years of service were placed below ribbons you get for just showing up to basic training. His branch insignia belonged to a completely different military specialty than the combat badges on his chest. And his unit shoulder sleeve patch was sewn on backward. Literally backward. No active duty officer, no matter how distracted or careless, wears a uniform like that. And definitely not someone claiming to be a decorated major. I stared at that photograph for a long time. And I knew. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew something was desperately wrong. Let me pause here because I need to be honest with you at this moment. I had a choice. I could have ignored this. I could have decided that whatever was happening with Richard was none of my business, that my family had made their choice about me, and I had made mine about them. I could have let whatever was about to happen unfold without interference, and I actually considered it. I spent that entire evening thinking about whether I owed them anything. These were people who had thrown me out, who had celebrated my exile, who had treated my military service like it was a character flaw instead of a calling. Why should I risk anything for them? That internal argument lasted hours. But it came down to something simple, and this is what I want you to understand about how integrity actually works. Integrity isn't about other people. It's not about earning approval or creating a redemption narrative where your family realizes they were wrong. Integrity is about being the kind of person you decided to be, regardless of whether anyone's watching or whether you'll ever be thanked. So I made my decision. I logged into military personnel databases that I had authorized access to through my work. I pulled Richard's official file. There was no Major Richard Vance in any Army personnel system. Nothing. 0 records. I expanded my search. I went through federal databases. I cross-referenced names with the Defense Department. Nothing. Whoever Richard Vance was, he was a complete fabrication. That's when my investigative training kicked into overdrive. I started digging deeper. And what I found in the next 72 hours was worse than I had imagined. Richard's real name was Gregory Paul Miller. 8 years prior, he had been dishonorably discharged from the military for payroll theft. He wasn't a decorated officer. He was a disgraced logistics clerk who had stolen money and been thrown out of the service with all the honor you'd expect from someone who commits federal crimes. His entire life was a performance. The defense technology startup? Registered in the Cayman Islands. Phantom company. The wealth? Built on fraud. I coordinated with federal fraud investigators who had been tracking him for months. They had been watching his pattern target wealthy families, create a false military identity, gain their trust, then systematically drain their accounts. And he had already begun the draining. My father had been convinced to liquidate $450,000 from his retirement fund into what Gregory claimed was an exclusive investment opportunity. My sister had co-signed bridge loan paperwork for over $500,000, thinking she was helping her new husband secure working capital for his business. The papers were forged. And the plan, according to the federal investigators, was for Gregory to vanish the moment the marriage was legally finalized. He was booked on a flight to Dubai for midnight that same day. By morning, my father and sister would have realized their financial ruin. I spent the week before the wedding working with federal agents. We coordinated timing, we gathered evidence, and I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I was going to show up at that wedding. I was going to be visible. I was going to be impossible to ignore. And I was going to do it in my dress uniform. The day of the wedding arrived hot and bright. I put on my Army service dress uniform, the one with the perfectly aligned chevrons on my sleeves, the brass buttons that catch the light, the one that says everything without a single word. I stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, and I thought about my father throwing my clothes on the lawn. I thought about Sophia with her champagne flute, smiling at my destruction. I thought about all the years I could have spent trying to win back their approval. And I straightened my service cap, looked at myself, and walked out the door. The country club ballroom was exactly what I expected. Expensive, polished, full of people who had spent their lives performing status for each other. The double oak doors opened, and the sound of the reception fell silent. I could feel every eye in the room moving toward me, toward my uniform, toward the manila folder I held under my arm. The whispers started. I walked down the carpeted aisle slowly, not defiantly, just present, just undeniable. My father was standing near the floral arch with a champagne flute raised. When he saw me, the glass stopped mid-air. His face went through several emotions very quickly: shock, rage, humiliation. He handed his glass to someone beside him and marched toward me, his voice getting louder with every step. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. His voice echoed in the silent ballroom. "You were told never to come back. You have no right to show your face at your sister's wedding. You're an embarrassment to this family. You're embarrassing all of us." I didn't respond. I just waited. Sophia stepped forward, her veil trailing, her face flushed with anger and panic. "You weren't invited," she hissed, loud enough for the front rows to hear. She turned to the security guards positioned by the doors. "Security, remove her. Immediately. Get this failure out of my wedding." And then Richard stepped up beside her. Or Gregory. That's when I need to tell you who he really was, because seeing him in person for the first time was illuminating. He was maybe 45 years old, with the kind of grooming and posture that you only develop when you've spent years practicing. He had clearly studied how officers carry themselves, how they project authority. He was a walking textbook of what he imagined military power looked like. He puffed out his chest and looked at me with this practiced, cold stare designed to intimidate. And I realized in that moment that he had no idea who he was about to be confronted by. He'd never actually served. He'd never actually stood in front of someone whose entire profession is learning to read people. He had no defense against authenticity. "Listen here, Sergeant," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured authority. "You're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before I contact your commanding officer and explain how you've used your military affiliation to harass civilians. That uniform doesn't give you permission to disrupt my wedding day." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The entire ballroom had gone still. It was a specific kind of silence, the silence right before something breaks. I took one step closer to him, and I let my eyes find his eyes. And I said the thing that erased 3 decades of deception in a single sentence. "Gregory Paul Miller, you have active federal warrants across 2 states for wire fraud and grand larceny," I said. My voice was steady. "The uniform you're wearing was purchased from an internet costume vendor. Your military records don't exist. And the woman you're about to legally marry had no idea she was about to become complicit in fraud. He took an involuntary step backward. The color drained from his face so completely that for a moment I wondered if he would collapse. Someone in the back of the ballroom gasped. My father turned to look at Gregory with confusion and then dawning horror. "What is she talking about?" he demanded. His voice had changed. He suddenly sounded small. I turned directly to my father, and I held out the manila folder. Every certified document was there, every warrant, every bank statement showing the fraudulent transfers, the false investment papers he had signed, the forged business licenses, the Cayman Islands Shell Company, everything. He took the folder with trembling hands and began reading, and I could watch the moment it all became real to him. I could see the exact second he understood that he had been played. I turned to Sophia, and I told her the truth about every lie he had told her, about the bridge loans that would have destroyed her credit, about the business opportunity that was nothing but a siphon designed to funnel her inheritance away, about the flight to Dubai that he had booked for tonight. She went very pale. Her hands started shaking. "Richard," she said, her voice very small, "tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't real." He couldn't speak. His jaw was working, but nothing came out. Sweat was beading across his forehead. And then the side doors of the ballroom opened, with what felt like perfect timing. 4 federal agents in dark jackets entered, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. The lead agent walked directly to Gregory and produced handcuffs. "Gregory Paul Miller, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny." The moment the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the ballroom erupted. Sophia began to cry, these gasping, uncontrollable sobs. Some of her friends tried to comfort her. Others were filming on their phones. My father stood frozen, holding the evidence folder, looking like he was trying to solve an equation that would make his life make sense again. The federal agents escorted Gregory out, reading him his rights as they moved through the crowd. And then there was silence. This different kind of silence. The kind that comes after everything has been broken, and everyone is trying to figure out what piece goes where. My father dropped to his knees beside Sophia, and he was crying. Actually crying. Tears running down his face as he held the bank statements, showing the $450,000 that he had nearly lost. Sophia reached out a trembling hand toward me. "Tessa," she said, her voice destroyed. "Thank you. I can't believe you. Why would you?" She couldn't finish. And my father looked up at me with this expression that I will never forget. It was a collision of shame, gratitude, and desperate hope. He thought this was a turning point. He thought that saving them from financial ruin meant we could somehow return to before the rejection, before the lawn, before the distance of 10 years. He thought my presence meant forgiveness. He stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward me. "Tessa," he said, and his voice was breaking. "You saved us. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. Please, please, come home. Let us be a family again. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." He held out his arms. And I need to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what people always want to feel in this situation. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel healing. I felt sad. Deeply, deeply sad. Because I realized that he still didn't understand. He still thought this was about him. He still thought that if he apologized, if he cried, if he begged, the past 10 years could be collected like loose papers and put back into a drawer. He didn't understand that some things, once broken, don't go back together the same way. I was wearing my Army service dress uniform. I had medals on my chest that represented years of sacrifice, integrity, and service to something larger than myself. Those medals meant something. My father looked at them like they were foreign objects. He looked at me like I was someone he didn't recognize because I wasn't the girl he had thrown out. That girl was gone. I had been rebuilt in her place, and that rebuilding didn't include him. I took a small step backward, and I said something that I had rehearsed many times but had never expected to actually say out loud. 10 years ago, you threw my bags onto the lawn, I said, and my voice was very calm. You told me I was a failure. You told me I would never amount to anything. You told me I was no longer welcome in your home, in your life, in your family. And I accepted that. I didn't fight it. I just left. And I built a life where I didn't need your approval, where my value wasn't tied to whether you believed in me. I paused, and I could feel the entire ballroom holding its breath. I didn't come here today for your apology. I didn't come here to reconcile. I came here because my uniform means something. It means duty. It means integrity. It means protecting people, even when they've hurt me, even when they don't deserve it. That's what I did today. I protected you. But protection isn't forgiveness. And I won't pretend that an apology can undo a rejection. My father's face crumbled. He reached toward me again, but I turned away. Sophia was standing behind him, still in her wedding dress, looking destroyed. I thought about saying something to her, but I realized there was nothing left to say. We had shared a childhood, but we had not shared a life. She had made her choice about me when she was 17 years old, standing in our kitchen with a champagne flute in her hand, smiling at my exile. Some things don't heal through a single dramatic moment. I hope you both figure out how to be okay, I said quietly. And then I turned and walked back toward the ballroom doors. I need to pause here and be honest about something, because I know what happened next matters to a lot of people. They want to know if my family eventually rebuilt their relationship with me. If there was a second conversation, a healing, a reconciliation that came later. And I'm not going to tell you that story, because it's not the story I came here to tell. What I want you to understand is this: sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to make it about reconciliation. Sometimes the real power comes from understanding that your own integrity is not dependent on other people's redemption. My father had certain beliefs about success. He believed that military service was beneath his family. He believed that prestige was the highest value. He believed that you could throw someone away if they disappointed you. Those weren't beliefs that were going to disappear because I showed up in a uniform and proved him wrong. They were going to disappear because he was going to have to spend years thinking about them. And that's not my responsibility. What I learned from this is something I think a lot of people need to hear, especially if you come from families where conditional love was the normal language. The mistake most people make is believing that if they just prove their worth, if they just achieve enough, accomplish enough, save enough, then the people who rejected them will finally understand their value. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes people reject you not because you're not enough, but because they're too limited to see what you are. And there's a specific kind of freedom that comes from accepting that. There's a liberation in understanding that you don't need them to validate what you already know about yourself. Here's what I do know now. The federal charges against Gregory eventually resulted in a conviction. He's serving time for fraud. My sister and father were able to reverse the fraudulent transfers through the court system, though it took months and significant legal expense. My sister became a competent physician. My father continued running his business. And I continued my military career, eventually earning promotion to sergeant first class, continuing to specialize in criminal investigation, continuing to build a life that was entirely my own construction. We exist in the same city. We don't speak. And I'm completely at peace with that. If you've ever been in a position where you had to choose between being right and being connected, where you had to understand that protecting someone doesn't require loving them, then you might understand why this moment changed me. It wasn't the confrontation that mattered. It wasn't the arrest. It wasn't even proving my father wrong. What mattered was the moment I realized that I no longer needed him to be right about me. And that realization is the moment everything shifts. So I want to ask you something as we close out this story, and I want you to really sit with it. If you were in a position where you had to choose between acceptance from people who had hurt you, or integrity that was entirely your own, which would you choose? Would you take the apology? Would you walk away? Because I think that question says something really important about what you believe about yourself. Comment down below and let me know. Are you someone who would accept the reconciliation? Or are you someone who would walk away? And while you're thinking about it, tell me where you're watching from. What time is it where you are right now? And has anyone ever made you feel like you had to choose between your values and belonging? I think a lot of you have. I think that's why this story resonates. So drop a comment, let's talk about it. Before you scroll away, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. There are stories like this one coming every week, stories about people who had to become their own validation system, who had to understand that integrity is something you build for yourself, not for anyone else. Stories about what happens when you stop asking permission and start building power. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and make sure you don't miss the next one. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.